very big welcome to Monika Jaroszonek from Ratio.City, who is joining us for Drastic Talks today. Now, Monika has always been fascinated by cities, and she was actually an architect. And so today we're going to talk about her transition from architect to now developing the tools that allow architects to build cities. Monika, thank you very much for joining us.
Excellent, good to be here.
So we had a lovely discussion the other day about your passion for cities and urban landscapes. Let's just go into that in a lot more detail and about what led you to becoming an architect.
Mm-hmm. I think most architects, when you talk to them, it goes back to childhood, and everybody loves playing with Legos and creating things. And even as a kid, I was always fascinated by cities, and I loved traveling to cities and seeing cities. And as I got older, again, I read more about cities, I studied cities, and I was really fascinated how every single city you go to is very unique. And each city, I think, is a direct result of the various forces that act upon it. And so, some of it is built form. Some cities are built on the ocean, some are on lakes, some are on rivers. Each city has different, historical backgrounds, the political structures that created cities. Cities that have access to a lot of capital, a lot of money, are different than cities that are much poorer. And so if you think about traditional cities, ancient Rome and the Romans, the Vatican being built by the popes, the impact of the kings and queens and emperors on the face of cities, it's really fascinating to see all of these factors. And I also think that, cities are a physical manifestation of the society that we live in. Human beings have lived in cities for millennia, and we're going to continue to live in cities, and they represent the sort of the best of us, and amazing things really happen in cities. They've always been centers of culture and invention and innovation, and they're going to continue to be that because human beings are social creatures. We like being around other humans.
Yeah, we do. And it's interesting how, while all these factors shape the cities that we live in, there's also immigration and the way that they shape the cities as well. And we often have French quarters and Chinatowns and things like this in cities. And as these various communities have moved into them, they create their own shape within these environments as well.
Yeah. So I studied architecture, and through, as a student, it was a co-op program. So we were able to work in offices, as we were completing our studies. And I was lucky enough to be able to travel to various cities. And so I lived in London, England for a number of terms. I lived in Rome for 4 months. I lived in LA. I traveled all around, and I ended up settling here in Toronto because of what you sort of mentioned. Because I think Toronto is a really interesting new world city that is growing remarkably. And it's got a remarkably diverse population from around the world. And, I love living here because, people from all over the world have come here to study, to start new lives, to start new businesses. And so there's a great energy that results in that. And also, as an architect, it requires a lot of housing. So we've got, hundreds of thousands of people moving to this region from around the world. And so there's a great demand for new housing typologies and, workspaces and spaces to study as well. So it's fascinating to see how cities are going to continue to grow and change. And Toronto's right in the middle of that right now.
And cities and urban environments are kind of like a living organism, the way that they are constantly changing and evolving with supply and demand and the various cultures that are moving into them. And it must be fascinating to actually have a hand in that changing organism.
Well, and not only looking at, again, those external factors that impact, the built form, but actually all of the systems of the built form within cities that allow us to live in cities. Something as really boring as sewers and water supply and electrical supply and healthcare systems, the actual built buildings that make up cities, all of these are, the transportation systems. And so cities are remarkably complex, and they can be thought of as living organisms. And so what's interesting for me about thinking about all these, physical systems within cities is they can all be described using data. And, right now, it's really hard to get data about, transportation systems and sewer systems and the buildings and all the planning rules and regulations that govern the kind of built form that can be built in a city. And so that was also sort of part of the genesis of what we're building now at Ratio.City is, how do you describe cities and how do you make the data about all of these physical systems about cities available to professionals who need it to support their work, in building cities for the rest of us. And so that's what we're starting to build at Ratio.City is a digital platform that aggregates data about all of these systems and make it available for professionals like architects, like urban planners, like municipal city planners who create the policies, like real estate developers and landowners who own the properties, who are looking to build more housing or whatever the case may be to bring to market. And how do you make all that information available to them so that they can make better decisions and provide those environments for all of us?
Absolutely, because when it is a fragmented process in order to go about piecing together all these various data points, you don't have a full picture of that whole puzzle. There are pieces missing. So what are some of the systems that you use in order to bring together all these various elements?
So again, my background is architecture. So I've been practicing here as an architect. And what I did in my previous career was I'd work with landowners and real estate developers, and they would come to me and they say, hey, I've got this parking lot. What can I build on this parking lot? And so what I needed to do was figure out, where's the parking lot? How big is the parking lot? What's nearby? What's under construction nearby? What am I allowed to build? Is it close to a subway station? Is it close to a park? Who's the counselor? Who do I need to talk to about this? And so there's a lot of research. So again, the kinds of things that we started looking at is bringing together all the planning policy and the property data, about each parcel in the city, starting to bring in, maps of all the parks across the city and where all the transit stations are, and starting to think about how to bring that in, make it really easy to use. It's all in one place, linking in, whether it's building permits or development applications, what's happening nearby. So I can see, there's 5, 10-story buildings that are currently under construction just up the street. And then, not only to bring the data together, but then to allow our users, like architects or urban planners to do some analysis to understand, what does a 10-story building look like on the site? How many units would fit into, a building of this size? And again, because, what's the impact of that built form? And so is this building going to cast a shadow on the park just down up the street? If I move the building over or if I change the setbacks or the step backs, will that eliminate those shadow impacts? And so again, how do you provide dynamic analysis tools to be able to run that kind of scenario modeling very, very quickly? Is what we started, and we just keep growing and adding more data and more types of analysis as we go.
You made a great point about in our initial conversation about how growing a startup is quite similar to taking on a new project as an architect, because you've got the numerous stakeholders around the table who you're interacting with and trying to meet the various needs of all of those stakeholders. You've got the developer who would like to maximize profit. You've got the architect who would like to maximize the aesthetic appeal for generations to come. You've got the council or the local authorities that obviously want something that's that can be utilized within their parameters, and then you've got all the other various policy makers and things. So what is it that this does, Ratio.City does, that can help to appease or help make better decisions for all these various stakeholders?
Yeah, well, I think it's also, whether it's a generational thing, if you think of how ancient Rome was built, it's obviously very different from how we build our cities today. But essentially, there's always multiple stakeholders involved, in any kind of, construction, building construction. But the tools haven't really kept up. And so, most of us, I'm sure, are familiar with, Google Suite. And so, Google Docs or Google Sheets, where everyone can be working on a document at the same time. And so what we think is really interesting is, how do you not only bring the data together in an easy to use format, but how do you provide collaboration tools so that everyone who is thinking about a project is sitting at the same, digital virtual table, as it were, so that not only the counselor whose ward or whose district this project is in is aware of it, but it's also easy to use so that members of the public, who are participating in the public consultation process also can see, what this is going to look like, how it's going to impact, the view from their house or from their garden or whatever the case may be. And then how do you share information within the consultant team so that the engineer and the architect and the client, the real estate developer are all on the same page, and so that they understand if they make one change, if in order to reduce the shadow on the park, you're gonna have to move the top 2 stories over. Well, what does that actually mean for the total buildable area? How is the building going to look? How do we mitigate this and that? And so, we're also thinking about, who are all the various stakeholders involved in all of these discussions, and how can we provide a easy to use web-based tool so that they don't have to be in the same place. We're not building styrofoam models anymore that you go to a single place to see, but that you can share a link to, whether it's the community or the people that you're going to be having, a meeting with, so that they can see in 3 dimensions what this looks like within their community, spin it around, and be able to come prepared to have a productive and proactive conversation about, what are the actual built form impacts, and are there, adjustments that can be made to increase the utility for everyone. So that's definitely how we're thinking about some of our tools.
It's very dynamic, and as you say, your tools need to be dynamic, because unlike the polystyrene models, if the client came back and said, well, actually I've decided to increase this by a square meter, then you're, oh no, back out with the glue. So this allows you to have this really dynamic tool that enables so many people to have their fiddle and make their changes.
It's like in reality, right? I mean, there are no correct answers in life or in real estate. There's just an infinite number of variations, and there's always trade-offs. And so yes, if you're looking at an affordable housing initiative, yes, you want to provide more affordable housing, but what, the bigger it is, the more expensive it is to build. And what, maybe the most straightforward way to build it will cause some shadow impact. And so again, there's trade-offs. And so okay, maybe maybe this is a benefit that we want to see, and we're willing to accept this trade-off. But again, all of that is very, very dynamic. But in order to be able to explain that really clearly so that everyone understands what the issues are, I think is really interesting. And then to be able to see those options, quickly, to be able to test which one's actually the best for the long term.
That's right. I was really interested recently to see that from an ecological point of view, cities and dwelling within cities is actually the best for our environment from a carbon footprint perspective. Why is this? Is it just the transport and the density of population?
I think it's again goes back to all of those systems within our urban environments. And yes, you know what, if people live closer together, you need less roads. And so yes, all of a sudden public transit makes more sense, because you have a certain density of population. The amount of energy required to heat, one apartment within a larger complex is significantly less than to heat a detached single family home, because there's just less outside perimeter. I mean, it's math at a certain point. And so between the energy costs for heating and cooling and transportation, I mean, that's a significant amount of our carbon footprint. And also the resources, right? I mean, urban centers, you know what? If you can walk to school, you don't need bus routes. And so again, like, it's just, the cost of providing a lot of these services when the population is distributed is much higher. And so, that's why you get amazing resources in crowded urban centers, because you've got more of a population that can use it. I live in Toronto. We've got a great university network, a health network here, because there's a lot of research that's being done between the universities and the hospitals. And so we have this great density of hospitals. There's 5 of them, all within like 2 blocks of each other, but it supports a significant population. If you live in a smaller town, you can't have that density of research in the same way. It just doesn't make sense.
That's again the same with say last mile logistics, and having our life is just click and deliver now as well, and just having that instantaneous service to our door. I remember in New York years ago when I lived there, for $5 you could have anything delivered. And it was just a revelation. People don't use kitchens anymore. So the way that we're using our homes is also evolving due to this urbanization, perhaps. Are there any really interesting trends that you've noticed that have been thrown up as a result of your software and the information it's providing?
Well, I think, it's early days. I mean, in the same way that, city building is a long process, cities exist for thousands, like hundreds, or if not thousands of years. Buildings last for generations. It takes a while. So we've existed as a company for about 3 years, and so now we're starting to see projects that have been sort of initiated on our platform now starting to come into reality. But what I'm really interested in is, what are the long-term implications of the current pandemic that we're in on the built form of cities? And again, when you look back over history, pandemics have always had some form of impact on the built form of cities. We were talking earlier about, the water supply and sewage, in London, England, being constructed as a reaction to the various cholera outbreaks over time. Zoning bylaws and separation distances were a result of tuberculosis, in North America. New York has some of the oldest zoning bylaws in the world, in order to create safety. So, what are the long-term implications? And actually what I think is that we're starting to see more and more is a flexibility of use, that where before, especially in North America, there was an idea that zoning uses should be very, very much separated, that you live in this neighborhood and you work over here and you have factories over here. I think this idea of mixed communities and this idea of 15-minute communities is going to resonate more and more, that we need to have communities where you can live and work and have, maybe small scale manufacturing to reduce, our demand, our reliance on global supply chains. And so this idea that, maybe if there is a reduced demand for commercial office space right now, maybe those buildings can be converted to provide more housing, or, maybe if those, if retail malls are not going to be existing the same way they did before, maybe they can be converted to, co-working spaces, or maybe they will become those distribution centers to deal with the last mile logistics. And so this idea of converting, I think, is going to be something that we're going to start seeing more and more of going forward. And again, in order to be able to make that evaluation, you're going to need access to and understand the systems that surround your assets. And so whether it's the mall, you need to know how big is that parking lot that's currently standing empty, what's nearby, how long does it take to get to a population density of X number of million people, what are the nearest transportation nodes, what's allowed on this site. And so again, thinking about, how can our data start allowing and supporting that kind of flexibility in the future is interesting.
Yeah, and those decisions. And I think there's so much talk about working from home, but it's just not an option for so many people. So it's not as if there is going to be a complete eradication of some sort of office space. People still need that. And you must be finding that in the data that you're able to produce.
Mm-hmm. No, and I mean, even personally, again, we're a tech startup. Everything we do is in the cloud. We were able to pivot to working from home very easily, but we all miss being at the office. Like, given the choice, we would be there in a heartbeat. We miss people, and we miss, oh God, I miss going out for lunch, right? Just to have somebody else make my lunch for me.
And my children's lunch for me.
So as soon as we're able and as soon as it's safe, things like that are going to come back. I think there will be, again, increased flexibility. So maybe we do it for just 3 days a week and we work from home the other 2 days. Or maybe there is this sort of in between, instead of commuting all the way to downtown, maybe there is something in my neighborhood that I can go to, just get out of the house, see other people, get some novelty into my day. So I mean, if I think for white collar workers, there's going to be, as soon as we're able to, I think people will go back to their spaces. But yeah, absolutely. There's also going to be people who are supporting all of the systems that allow us to work from home. And so whether it's food distribution and delivery, those are also absolutely critical roles that involve, access to labor, transportation and transit options. And again, how do we make sure that we can support them so that they can support the rest of the population as well?
Definitely. We're certainly seeing a trend here. in more suburban type working environments. And a recent research by Savills said that in their 5-year forecast that when they asked their clients how many of them expect to be in the office in January 2022 and how many days a week, most people responded that between 2 and 3 days a week. So what that means is people who are planning their office and their workforce, so to speak, they still have to have these office environments. But it is about having these in more suburban areas that also has the added benefit of taking the pressure off the transport systems, especially during peak times. So again, that must have a huge impact on government's long-term policy in transportation and how they're going to shape that going forward post-pandemic.
Yeah. But again, I mean, the timelines involved, building transit is a significant infrastructure investment. It does take, many, many years to study and to design new lines and then to figure out the service capacities and all the rest of it. Again, I think it's still very, very early days. And what was interesting, here in Toronto over the past 15 years or so is more and more housing was built in the downtown core, very close to the traditional financial district. And it was a very young population that moved in because they didn't want to commute in from the suburbs. They just wanted to walk to work. And so all of a sudden, the demographics of the downtown shifted. And so you've got, this population of recent grads who are in their 20s and 30s. They've got great, jobs in the financial sector or the insurance sector or whatever the case may be, working in these big office towers, and they walk to work. And so they're not actually commuting. They actually are right there, which makes a really lively downtown, because also it means that at all times of day and on weekends, there's all sorts of activity. So they're not going to be commuting out to the suburbs. They're, so I think there's going to be, again, I think, I can see, especially for larger corporations, to have multiple spots where staff can come to wherever it's easy and convenient for them. I think the flip side on the sort of commercial market is there had been a trend over many years to reduce the amount of square feet per employee within office space. I think there will be a reaction to that for people who are working within offices, they will all of a sudden have more space again. So I think the actual size of offices will actually remain the same. There'll be fewer people, just more square feet per person. So I think the math will actually kind of work out to about the same.
That's a good point. Yeah, they're now obligated to provide more space. So I think gone is the day of the sort of however many foot by however many feet space, and it's all about safety now as well.
Well, and also, I mean, what we miss about being back in the office is the collaboration. And so I think there'll be more amenities provided to be able to have, those working meetings where you have everyone in a room with a whiteboard and bouncing ideas off each other. And so, yes, maybe there are hot spotting offices as opposed to just a desk in an open space. Maybe you do have, a trend more back towards slightly more enclosed offices than we had for a number of years, but that, more boardrooms that you can reserve for a few hours or for a few days to be able to get that creative work done when you are together in the same space. And then when you're actually need to do quiet, focused work, then you work from home or wherever. And so again, I think that the way that we use offices is going to shift a little bit, but I think fundamentally offices will still exist.
Are you seeing much change in the way that residential amenity space has changed over the last couple of years in response to our appetite for Amazon and perhaps biking to work, those sorts of things, the way that the refuse is handled?
Well, no, absolutely. And so both with the deliveries, there's definitely increased, the mail room has had to get much, much larger. And so to be able to store, I know there are some buildings that are providing, refrigerated storage for parcels for food delivery. Here in Toronto, we are growing our bike lanes. And so there are requirements for new buildings to provide bike indoor, protected bike storage, so that it becomes easier to use to commute via bicycle than with a vehicle. So yeah, I think stuff like that is slowly changing. But again, the rules and regulations, are very reactionary. And so it takes a few years before, those requirements for the bike spaces and for the larger garbage area and the larger delivery rooms to sort of filter all the way through to actually be constructed. And so for existing buildings, operators and owners are trying to retrofit some of their buildings, or at least, I guess, staff them in order to deal with all the deliveries, because it's a challenge.
Well, some property developers might say that they're going too far the other way and taking up valuable square footage in amenity space by demanding that you can fit 50 bikes when in actual fact you've got 10 parked there.
Yeah.
It's really hard to know, and that's where data comes in.
Yeah, no, and it is a bit chicken and egg, right? And so, if you have the space, is it more likely that you would buy a bike and then commute? If you know that you don't have the space, you're probably not going to buy a bike, so you've got nowhere to store it. And so you do need to provide the resources. If you build it, they will come. I'm definitely kind of a component of that.
We spoke about Toronto and how there is such a population growth there, especially diversity, and you've got 120 people a year coming to, 120,000 people a year coming to the country. So the city, sorry. With the pandemic now, there's a lot of talk about deurbanization. Is this something that you can see is a long-term trend, or is this just reactionary to the pandemic?
I see this as strictly reactionary. Again, a lot of cities around the world, have had affordability problems in the past. And so, if all of a sudden you are required to commute to your job every day, yes, it does make sense to go to a smaller town where the cost of living might be less. However, again, when I look back over history, I think cities have always been centers of innovation and culture and business, and that will continue. And so there is something to be said about being in close proximity to people, as you build your professional networks, as a young graduate, to be able to learn about different roles and different jobs and different industries. You can do that much more easily in a, larger metropolitan center than you can in a small town. So I see it as very reactionary. Again, as soon as we're allowed to go back and gather and go to great restaurants and go out to bars and sit on patios again, we will want to do that, because again, people have been doing it. I think you mentioned a trip to Pompeii recently, and it's fascinating. People have been doing this for years because it's fun, it's great. And so as soon as we can, we'll come back. And yeah, I mean, people move from cities to suburban areas all the time, and they also move in the other direction as well. So nothing is new. I think we just seem to be reading about it a bit more right now, but
yeah, it's the media sensationalizing a reaction to this. One thing that I've found that I never ever thought that I would is I was walking through King's Cross St Pancras station, one of the busiest in London, and I missed the crowds, and it's nearly empty. And for the first time in my life, I thought, I miss the buzz of the city. And that's quite a remarkable thing to feel.
Well, and I think back in the fall, again, there was a beautiful weekend, and my family and I went to one of the local sort of urban parks here, and it was crowded, and everyone just had their picnic blankets, again, spread out nicely, but it was just so beautiful just to see all of these people all at once, and just to see all these faces, and it made me tear up a little bit. I was like, oh my gosh, I miss seeing all these people. So we're all looking forward to that. Yeah.
And just looking from a business perspective now, and just turning to that, how are you finding, obviously, sorry, wait a moment, and then we're going to have to come back to this question. It was probably well timed. My son's just decided to print. I'm glad this is being edited.
That's fine.
Okay, thank you, Ralph.
I think you got your headphones on, so actually I couldn't hear it anyway, so it's fine.
Oh, really? Well, that's good to know. So next time I'll just ignore it, but I know that they're editing these, so they can edit that out. We touched a little bit on the downsides of the lockdown as far as not being able to collaborate in person with your colleagues. What are some of the other things that you're finding about running a 3-year-old tech company in this type of environment?
Well, it's definitely forced us to continue to be innovative and flexible. In the before times, we used to, when approaching customers and clients, we used to do in-person demos, or we'd go to people's boardrooms and meet them and do training sessions in person. So again, like everyone else, we had to pivot to Zoom, and it's tiring, it's exhausting. It takes a little while to get used to the format, but that's been fine. We've, as a company, again, had to really carefully look at how we communicate internally, just to make sure that everyone had the information that they needed, because you forget that when you're in the same space, you can just kind of eavesdrop and hear about what's going on. You can sort of sense the energy, but when everyone's working independently, it's really hard to recreate that and to continue to build a culture. So, you know what? We're trying to figure out how many meetings is optimal, because you need some meetings in order to be able to connect synchronously, to make sure everyone's got the information that they need to do their work, but still give people enough time to focus and actually do some of their thinking work as well. So we do really weekly meetings by teams. We do every 2 weeks a whole all hands meeting, and so we try to make sure that we really super explicitly over communicate to make sure everyone knows what's going on. So that's been all right. But again, we all miss being back at the office.
That's right. And even shaking hands with clients. It's just, it's really challenging, isn't it? Just not to have that touch, as we touched on earlier. Have you made any changes to your product offering as a result of the recent changes in the environment?
Well, you know what? Even before the pandemic hit, we had planned a major product revamp as well. So most of 2020, actually, our tech team spent rebuilding our entire product from the ground up. So it essentially was a bit reactionary from our first version, which was very, very Toronto specific. Again, so we created a tool that solved a specific problem that we were focused on. And so now we were able to build a global data engine that can now ingest data from anywhere in the world much more easily, much more rapidly. So it'll allow us to support much more rapid geographic expansion. So that wasn't a reaction to the pandemic. That was actually just planned regardless. And so we just kept working on it during the year. But I think what was interesting for us is that over the course of the pandemic, we still kept selling to our traditional customers, the real estate developers, the architects, the urban planners, but we got more and more interest from the municipalities themselves. And so, looking at the folks that are sitting on the other side of the table that are creating a lot of these policies and providing a lot of this data to get access to it for their staff as well, because their staff also all of a sudden had to work from home, and municipalities have much larger legacy systems that they're dealing with. And so they're not all cloud-based. Most of them have, secure servers at the office, which is much more difficult for them to access. And so to think about how they move some of their processes to a cloud-based environment has been really interesting. So we haven't really adapted our product, but we've both seen that the messaging has resonated with a new group much more so than previous.
That's great that you've been able to move into this whole new sector that perhaps wasn't even on your radar before. And it seems that these are these organizations are the ones producing the data, but it's not available throughout the various public offices. And they do need someone in the private sector to bring all that data together. And that's quite interesting, isn't it? That this is the private sector driving this.
Yeah, no, and again, most cities have open data portals. And so again, a lot of this data is in the public domain, but unless you specifically have a background in GIS, geographic information management systems, and the software to run this, that data is very difficult to access. And so, again, this idea of being, from the private sector, providing an easy to use web-based platform. You don't need to install anything. You don't need to download anything. It all just exists. Assuming that you've got a decent, Wi-Fi connection, you can see all the data and figure out what's important to you. And that's been the sort of spot that we've managed to move ourselves into quite quickly.
That's right. It's the biggest hurdle with data is actually the interpretation of that, to ensure that you are understanding exactly what it is spitting out. There's a really great book where they say that they can statistically prove that babies come from storks if you don't understand that data and what it's actually trying to say to you. So it seems that what you do is interpret that data so that people who need to make these decisions are able to best make decisions.
Absolutely.
Great. Is there anything else you want to add before we wrap up?
No, I think that pretty much covers it. I think this, yeah, very, very interesting chat and conversation. It was great to be able to talk about, cities in general. Again, one of my favorite topics of conversation.
Sure. And where can people find you?
So our website is Ratio.City. And I'm available also via LinkedIn, Monika Jaroszonek, Jaroszzonek.
Great. Thank you very much, Monika, for your time.
Excellent.